Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps and stories wake. Tonight, we cross an old bridge whose planks remember every footstep, and whose light has never truly gone out. Keep your lantern close, and follow softly into the fog. This is the lantern at Widow's Bridge. The town was small enough that people learned one another's rhythm. Knives were sharpened on the same wheel for a generation. Names were said and repeated until they fit into houses like well-worn keys. On the map it looked like any village, a market street, a church spire, narrow lanes that split and met again. Between its two halves ran a river so quiet it seemed to carry its own memory. At the river's narrowest point, a wooden bridge arched and settled like an old promise. By day it creaked and took the weight of carts and laughter. But at night it belonged to something else, to the hush between heartbeats, to the way light softens when it decides to leave. People called it Widow's Bridge not for any proper reason they could name, but because names sometimes cling to places like ivy. Before Elias, before letters beneath doors, there were other stories. Old Mrs. Ainsley, who ran the bakery, used to say that when she was a child she watched a woman stand on the bridge every evening for months. Her shawl was thin as a moth, Mrs. Ainsley would tell anyone who'd listen while kneading dough, but she stood like a tree. She waited for a boat that never came. The baker's hands shook when she remembered the way the woman's lantern would blink once, twice, like a polite knock at the edge of the world. There were other accounts, a fisherman who swore his net caught glimpses of blue light at dawn, a schoolboy who claimed the light had followed him home one rainy night until his mother made him say 3 words and the light left. Stories grew like moss, they softened edges and filled blank spaces. They were the town's small religion, a thing people bowed to quietly, without ceremony. Elias had lived all his life with the dependable sounds of making. He learned to listen to the way wood complained before it cracked, how a clock's tick could tell you when a gear was tired. He liked things that fixed and held shape, a chair that could be sat upon without fear, a hinge that made no surprise. He lived alone in a house that smelled of linseed oil and clean metal, with shelves of tools laid out like instruments in a careful, mute orchestra. So when the letter came, he treated it first like an oddity. Only later, in the hush of the evening by his small kitchen lamp, did the words curl into something that belonged to him. He read them until the edges of the script blurred and the ink smeared from the damp air. He slept badly that night and woke with the letter heavier in his coat than it had been. At dusk he wrapped himself in his father's coat and took the brass lamp. There was an old comfort in the shape of the lamp, a handmade truth, metal warmed under thumb, glass that fogged and cleared. He left a note on his table out of habit, though he didn't intend it for anyone, be back before dawn. He thought to himself that he would look, only look, and return. The lane toward the bridge felt longer than he'd remembered. Windows were dark, curtains pressed close like shut lids. A dog barked once and then listened. The river breathed against its banks, and a single gull lost its way and argued with the night. When he stepped onto the bridge, the timbre changed, it was as if the wood itself recognized him by the pressure of his soles. The lantern hovered ahead, not ordinary, but small, a cold flame that held blues where warm fires have gold. It did not flicker erratically. It did not smoke. It simply existed, a careful, slow eye along the planks. Elias followed. The boards whispered. Name carvings appeared under the lamplight, initial after initial, some old and mossed, some clean and fresh. He reached the center post and knelt. The letters AW, the widow's mark, stood out like a patient signature. The woman, if that is what she was, came into being beside the light like a memory turning its head. She did not walk, her presence filled space gradually, as though the fog remembered her first and then lent him her outline. Her eyes were not hollow. They were full of attention, they held the kind of sorrow that keeps counting. "What is this place?" Elias asked, making his voice match the quiet. "This is where she waited," said the presence, voice soft as old paper. "This is where promises were kept, and where they bitterly failed. The lamp remembers." "I remember." "How long have you been here?" Elias asked. The answer arrived like a slow exhale. Long enough to know which days the river remembers itself and which days it forgets. Long enough to learn that waiting is sometimes the only way to keep someone near. Elias listened, and in the listening he felt something unthread, a parade of names and small shames and acts of kindness stitched into the bridge's history. Some had given willingly, others not. The bridge had a ledger, and it kept accounts in the way old things do, without malice, only records. When he questioned what the bridge asked for, the widow, the shape of her, explained that the lantern was a stewardship. It was not malicious, it was practical. People left lights of many sorts on porches and steeples, the bridge kept one to remember those who had promised to return or those who had once belonged to its world. Occasionally, it would call someone who could change the ledger, someone who could add a name that would steady it for another year. You ask a lot of questions, she said, with a wry softness. Are you certain you want to answer? Elias thought of his father's hands, how they had learned to steady wood until it sang with use. He thought of small promises he had kept, of clocks he'd wound for neighbors who forgot their own birthdays. He felt a strange tenderness toward this impossible, patient place. If something needs tending, he said, I will tend it. I do not hold superstitions, only responsibility. She watched him as autumn breathed mist into the air. Then you will become a bearing point. You will learn the hours the bridge prefers. You must not treat it like a thing to be fixed. It is not a hinge. It is a memory. He nodded, though thinking memory was not something the measure of his life had prepared him to do. The bridge then showed him, gently, how its remembering worked. It let his lamp look into the water and showed him reflections as if opening a book, a boat in rain, a shawl laid to dry, a child's laughter trapped between oars. The lantern drew those scenes like moths to a porch light, gentle and insistent. Elias learned names that night that were not his to keep. He saw small bits of life the bridge had held on to, a lover's coin, a promise folded into a pocket, a mother's hand pressed to a brow. Each memory was like a feather slipped into the grain of the wood. When he finally left, because leaving is always part of such bargains, the lamp in his hand had altered. The wick burned a steady cold blue, and the glass held a depth he had never known. The lamp would never be ordinary again. It was a conduit, a small breathing thing. On his way home, he noticed something odd in the lane, a string of tiny lights along the hedges, like someone had placed stars to guide him. They faded as he passed, polite and patient, and his house seemed to sigh in welcome. After that night, Elias changed in ways small and slow. He woke earlier without thinking, his hands cradling cups with steadier fingers. He fixed things with a new care, as though every joint might one day hold a memory. He sometimes found himself humming a tune he had never learned, and he would glance at the river as if it were a companion. When travelers crossed the bridge and muttered about how peaceful it had become, some claimed that a shadow stood at the center post now, a man with his head bowed, a watchman cast in the dusk. People would lay coins or a pressed flower on the wood if they felt moved, and those tokens were absorbed into the grain as if the bridge had no use for display but plenty for keeping. Yet not all was simply calm. The bridge asked things of the keepers. It had a soft economy, it would take, and it would give, but seldom without intention. Sometimes the cost was a small forgetting. A keeper might misplace the scent of a childhood place and never quite find it again. Another might wake with a grief that understood the names of strangers but kept no trace of the reason. Small absences, hidden and patient. One winter, a man named Harris, who had been keeper before Elias, left behind a small candle in a tin cup. He returned the next spring and found the candle melted into the wood. He said he felt lighter for not knowing why someone who mattered could be carried like that. He left town soon after, with the polite explanation that his work had taken him elsewhere. Some thought he'd simply moved on. Others suspected the bridge had asked for too much. Elias read about Harris years later in a register at the inn, a notation beside his name, left quietly. Elias wondered, sometimes, whether spending nights banked with memory had hollowed something out that the man could never repair. He would check the bridge at intervals, ashamed of the thought that his simple act of tending might have consequences for the soul. There were, too, nights when the lantern shone and the bridge called with a hunger Elias could feel in his teeth. On such nights the keeper would find letters left under doors again, notes that said nothing but invited. A man might step out to sea, then return with a new pallor about his eyes. The community learned to leave certain evenings empty. They would close shutters. Why risk the ledger if you had no name to spare? Elias found ways to bear it. He kept a small registry in his shop, under the false bottom of a drawer, dates, small signs he noticed, names that had drifted into the grain. He wrote them not so he could own them, but so future keepers would know the measure of what the bridge liked. It felt, in a way, like teaching the next person the right way to crank a clock, delicate, patient, respectful. He did not show the list to anyone. It felt too like faith. Over the years, children still dared one another to stand at the edge and count the lanterns, though the daring changed meaning. Instead of testing courage, it had become a ritual that sometimes yielded a small blessing. A child who lost a toy might find it returned at their doorstep the next day. A widow's cat would suddenly learn to come home by itself. People began to offer quiet thanks, not out of fear but out of gratitude for tiny mercies the bridge's light dispensed. And sometimes, on extremely rare evenings, Elias would hear laughter ripple across the water. Not cruel laughter, not loud, but the sort that sits behind eyes when a story finally finishes. He learned to listen for that sound as a sign the ledger had been balanced, at least for a while. The town adapted. The innkeeper kept a small lamp on the counter and served soup more slowly so strangers had time to ask about the bridge. Mothers told their children to toss a penny on the planks for good luck. Carpenters sanded the boards without replacing the old marks because they thought the carvings should be left as a map of all who had touched the place. Elias, for his part, aged as men do in places where weather is taken seriously. His hair thinned at the temples, his hands gained lines like fine riverbeds. He mended more than furniture, he mended quiet arguments, helped neighbors with small repairs, and listened to complaints that were really confessions. The town trusted him in the way small places trust the familiar. One autumn, when the fog came wrong and clung to faces with an extra patience, Elias found a small girl at the bridge, sitting with her knees tucked to her chest. She held a ribbon in her fist and watched the lantern as it drifted along the planks. Her hair was as thin as the old woman's shawl had been, and her eyes held the childish math of loss. "My name is Lottie," she told him without looking up. "I dropped my ribbon in the river. I think it was for Daddy." Elias sat beside her on the rail. "Sometimes things return when they want to be remembered," he said. She looked at him, hopeful and terrible at the same time, as children can be. He taught her the old words, not spells, but careful phrases: thank, leave, do not stare. He taught her that you can ask for mercy and still live with the answer. When she left that night, the ribbon was tied to the post where she could see it, drying like a small promise under the lamplight. Seasons followed seasons. Elias witnessed the slow repair of things as much as their giving away. Once, a cruel storm took down 2 posts and the bridge shuddered like a beating heart exposed. The town rallied, men hauled plank and rope and mended what could be mended. After that, the lantern burned steadier, grateful perhaps, or simply relieved to have a sounder structure beneath it. At length Elias grew older. He walked with a cane when the river no longer sounded as kindly as it used to. He noticed that certain likes fell away, the smell of a particular brand of tobacco, the taste of the first black coffee of the morning. He realized he could not recall the name of a neighbor's son he had once known well. The cost, he thought, was not that he lost himself but that the ledger absorbed fragments that were not always polite to give back. When the time came that he felt a coolness in his bones like an unlit room asking for a candle, Elias understood he had done what the bridge required of him. He had kept its ledger calm. He had added his name and did not mind being there. He had been loved in small ways and had learned the town's quiet. One late evening, when the mist came in wide and silver, Elias did not come into his house at dawn. The innkeeper discovered his lamp hanging from the post, the blue flame steady. Later, someone laid a pressed sprig of rosemary at the threshold of his small home in a neat, thin bundle. A note read simply, "Thank you." People said the river had a new tone that morning, as if it had exhaled and was lighter by a measure. The boards of the bridge creaked less, the names in its grain softened, and the lantern's light grew kinder still. For years after, travelers crossing the bridge would feel a slight steadiness under their feet, as though a watchful hand smoothed the way. Elias's name joined the others, carved faintly into the wood, E.F., a small mark beside W, and many more. It was not heroic, it was the truth, remembered, as the bridge remembered. In years to come, children would still dare one another to stand and look, but the dare had transformed into a ritual visit. People would leave small trinkets. Lovers would pin names on a curling scrap of paper. Artists painted the bridge at dusk. The town kept it like a public secret, and in that keeping, it kept itself. And sometimes on certain nights, when fog pooled thick and low and the world felt as soft as a closed book, someone crossing the bridge would feel a small warmth at their feet and a whisper like a thank you wind in their ear. If they paused and looked, they would see a lantern, steady and patient, and a shadow near the center post that dipped its head as if in benediction. You've been listening to The Whispering Hour. If the river ever forgets its mirror, and a small light calls your name, walk gently. And remember, some bridges never sleep. Good night.